Dark Souls was one of my favorite games back on the 360, and to this day, most of my favorite games were actually released during this console generation. Halo, Gears of War, the good Call of Duties, Dead Space, Mass Effect, really too many to be mentioned in this video, and any single one of them could have been the topic of this video. Something I do when I'm feeling nostalgic is I go back and play these older games, usually not for a full playthrough, but just enough to get my nostalgia hit while taking a break from chipping away at my backlog. And Dark Souls Remastered was supposed to be that same routine. I wanted to mess around in it for a short while, maybe even make it to Anne Orlando to fight Ornstein and Smo before finally locking down a playthrough of Elden Ring. What I didn't expect was me playing through the entirety of Dark Souls, fighting every single boss in the game, including the DLC, then going through New Game Plus right before starting a fresh save in order to record gameplay for this video. On top of that, I decided for the first time I'm not going to do any summons. I want to fight these bosses on an equal playing field. I'll say this right now, I suck at difficult video games. You won't catch me doing Soul Level 1 naked with a broken straight sword. I'm not that type of player. But no summons, that's pretty fair. It's about as spicy as I'll get. Plus, I made it through Sekiro. I barely scraped by, but I made it. It was time to pull up my big boy pants and turn the heat up a notch. Now, I'm not trying to side with the elitists who play Souls games, but I did have way more fun playing this way. But why Dark Souls? What makes this such a video game that it fully embraces the medium? Why is Dark Souls, of all games, what I feel like is missing the most from modern titles? Well, it's because Dark Souls, and really any game that From Software makes, doesn't dumb down the experience for the sake of accessibility. Now, when I say accessibility, I don't mean things like colorblind modes or the ability to change control schemes. I've seen people without the use of both their hands that are way more skilled than me playing games that they would otherwise not be able to experience without these options. What I mean about dumbing down the experience is when a game is so patronizing that it's insulting to your intelligence. How many times have you played an action RPG where you have a quest, right? And it goes into extreme detail of what you need to do. It has to give you a cutscene with a quest log, objective markers, NPCs constantly reminding you of what you need to be doing. And it'll be the most obvious things too, like go fetch something and bring it back, you damn dog. Everything will be signposted. It's like they're saying to you, hey stupid, put the square shape in the square hole. And even the most casual players are like, seriously, how stupid do you really think I am? What I love about Dark Souls is that it doesn't treat you like a child. It actually allows you to get stuck, to get lost. The first NPC you talk to after the tutorial tells you that you need to ring 2 bells. One up above in the undead church, and one far, far below in the ruins at Blighttown. You know exactly what you need to do, but where those bells are, what direction you need to take to get there, that's entirely on you. There's no blinking yellow marker, no pandering follower NPCs, not even a map to pull up. The game says, I trust you. You'll figure it out. Sure, you can turn the HUD elements off in other games and try to immerse yourself until you figure out that the game was designed around these UI elements. You were meant to hold the thumbstick in the direction you need to go while constantly referencing a mini-map or playing follow the yellow dot. There's no environmental cues like lighting techniques or anything natural to catch your eye, no points of interest to use to orient yourself, nothing like that. Dark Souls, on the other hand, is a very open game. I'd even argue that it's an open world game, but not that type of open world. It has a bunch of branching paths that lead to larger areas that interconnect and stack on top of themselves. It's very vertical. And it's goddamn genius with how it uses level design to guide you without ever holding your hand. Anyways, you're told that you need to ring that bell up above in the church, but the lift to that church is broken. There's many paths that branch out from Firelink Shrine, but only one path that leads upward. And that's the path to Undead Burg. You'll probably notice this huge-ass dragon that lands in front of you, shaking the ground beneath your feet before flying off in a specific direction. Well, if you follow that direction up towards the watchtower with the spiral staircase where you end up fighting the Taurus demon on the narrow bridge, you'll end up at a larger bridge that has black scorch marks on it. Well, when you try to cross that bridge, guess who shows up to roast your ass with fire? That same dragon. You quickly notice a stairway to your right and you duck down them in panic. Hey look, there's a ladder, so you kick it down. And it makes a shortcut to the last bonfire? Neat. Moving on, you make your way to the next area, and now there's two paths. The one on the right leads to Darkroot Garden, but the one on the left is a church. That guy in the beginning, he mentioned a church, didn't he? Well, if you run into the church, there's a brick shithouse with a great shield, and he'll flatten new players. You'll most likely run straight ahead to the lift for safety. Well, you take the lift down and holy shit, I'm back at Firelink Shrine? And it's around this time where your mind is blown. Am I playing a Metroidvania? Also, that Great Shield guy was guarding a Firekeeper soul that if you manage to nab, you can reinforce your Estus Flask with back at Firelink. But before you took the lift, there was a staircase directly to the right leading up. That path takes you all the way to the first Bell of Awakening, and to the first true boss fight, the Gargoyles. Dark Souls uses tons of environmental cues to nudge players in the right direction without them ever noticing on their first playthrough, and it's this type of game design that I rarely see in modern games anymore. Even in the newer Resident Evil games, though I still enjoyed them, I think they're great games, I couldn't get over all the yellow highlighting. I don't play survival horror games to have my hand held. I go in expecting to be punished for not managing my resources and ammo, and not knowing exactly where to go and getting lost is a huge part of the immersion factor for these games. Having yellow paint splattered all over the place and tape sticking out like a sore thumb, it breaks that immersion, because it's constantly reminding me that I'm playing a video game for the first time. While I didn't bother as much in the RE2 and RE3 remake or in 7, it was a lot more noticeable in 8 and downright obscene in the Resident Evil 4 remake. And it wouldn't have been a problem either if there was an option to toggle it off like in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but it didn't, and I think it's a good example of how accessibility for one player can dampen the experience for another player. But the most talked about issue that I've heard, and this sparked a debate during the release of Elden Ring, is combat difficulty, and how Elden Ring should have had an easy mode. Now, I don't have to go into detail on how this fundamentally breaks the intended experience of a Souls game because we already know how messing with the way damage multipliers work would completely change the way Elden Ring plays. But with news of Sony acquiring FromSoft's parent company, it has me deeply worried. We know Sony hates Bloodborne and refuses to port it to the PS5. If we had a From Software under the management of Sony, we wouldn't have a sequel for Bloodborne. And worst of all, the influence that Sony America has in the West would bring along that God-forsaken easy mode. The one thing that struck fear into our hearts. When they see the success of Elden Ring, they don't think, well, let's make more of that thing people love. No, they think, how can we turn this into a cinematic experience? A live service multiplayer game. Imagine playing as the Tarnished, holding the thumbstick forward while being talked at right before a combat section followed by a cutscene. Because that's how I felt when going from the old God of War games to God of War 2018 and Ragnarok. Watching the franchise I love be bastardized and churned into this formulaic, Uncharted, Last of Us type experience. Is anyone excited for the Dark Souls reboot? How about Elden Ring Battle Royale? But let me stop there before I get distracted. Difficulty and accessibility are two different things. Subtitles, they don't affect gameplay, but anything that changes difficulty heavily changes the gameplay experience. I'm sure we're all familiar with damage sponges, right? How just having enemies deal more damage and having more health doesn't necessarily make a game harder, it just makes them take longer. Dark Souls actually has difficulty options, believe it or not. It's called Havel's Armor. It's called the Zweihander sword in the graveyard at the beginning of the game. You upgrade that to plus 15 and it can carry you through the game. It's called summons, magic builds, you get the point. There's a very big difference between picking a difficulty option at the start of a game and having it in the game itself for players to craft their own experience through exploring the world and gameplay mechanics. Sure, you could just fight the Taurus demon on the bridge one-on-one while getting shot at by the archers above. Or you could kill the archers before the fight starts, lure the Taurus demon to the watchtower, and take half his damn health bar immediately with a plunge attack and make short work of him after. You could fight Ornstein and Smo alone like I did, or you could summon Solaire to get the aggro off of you while you fight one boss at a time. Everything in Dark Souls can be as easy or as hard as you want it to be without ever touching a difficulty slider. More often than not with difficulty options, I find that normal is too easy, but if I play on hard, it just becomes more tedious, turning a 5-minute fight into a 15-minute battle of attrition. I remember playing games like Devil May Cry back in the day, and raising the difficulty not only made them hit harder, but the enemy placement was different and there were more of them, making it to where you had to engage with every mechanic, forcing you to be this sexy, stylish, badass Dante. The worst thing that a game can be is boring. And you can't get immersed in a game when you're not actively participating in it. And Dark Souls reminded me of a time when games demanded my full attention. It made me appreciate what a simple checkpoint can do. Any Soulsborne fan will tell you that it's not those towering monstrosities themselves that were panic-inducing. It was the consequences for failure, because you knew that if you died, you would get sent back to the last bonfire and have to make the trek back to that fog door. During my latest playthrough, I chose to go for a dex build, and when I made it to those archers in Anor Londo, it drove me insane. Usually I just run up in my clanking armor with my shield up, but this time I was a glass cannon. Each time I'd get shot at by those damn archers, I would get sent flying off the ledge. And I couldn't understand why I was having so much trouble here this time around. Well, eventually I was able to bait one of them onto the roof and I slid past him. I immediately went to the next bonfire, lit it, and used the staircase jump to skip to the central hall. Like, you can literally skip half of the level this way. Where I thankfully activated the lever to the giant door. I say thankfully because if I wouldn't have, I would have had to trek all the way back to those damn archers again because I got sent back to the first bonfire of the level. Somehow, I forgot to sit at the closest bonfire to that fog door, and since I opened the shortcut, I was able to reduce the time of the run back. Remember too, I'm doing my first no summons run. Well, holy shit, Ornstein and Smo was difficult as hell without Solaire there to help me. I died and ran back for like 30 minutes straight before I thought, you know what? What if I try beating Smo first instead of waiting for Ornstein to lunge at me and trying to separate them between the pillars? It was such a close fight too, and I've always went for Ornstein first, but sure enough, it worked for me. I let out this huge sigh of relief and bellowed out, "Oh my god, that was so hard," before putting down the controller I had so tightly gripped in my hands. I know we all have these shared experiences where we finally get past a tough level or defeat a tough boss, and how satisfying it felt being one hit from death before pulling off that sweet victory. It's an experience I don't get from many games anymore, and it's one of the many reasons we're still talking about our favorite games to this day. We weren't just bullshitting with our coworkers like, "Hey, you play that new Call of Duty game yet? Yeah, it was good." No, we had a story to tell, and these conversations, these shared experiences, this is what makes the Souls community what it is today. This is why you see lore videos, let's plays, challenge runs, deep analysis videos still being watched by millions of people. I want you to think of a time. Remember that feeling you had when you played through your favorite video game for the very first time? When you just sat there watching the credits roll by as the music played? Wow, this is gonna stick with me for a long time, you thought. Now think of what you did right after. Did you put down the controller? Did you start playing a different game? Well, no. You jumped right back in, right? For a second playthrough. This is very important because games cost $70. Now, you could argue that the price of games going up is justified for whatever reason, but it doesn't change the fact that $70 is a lot of money to a lot of people. So we want as much game as we can squeeze out of that $70. Whether it's through multiplayer, extra modes, unlockable content, we need to justify that price tag. And the sad thing is, most single player games being made today are only designed to be played through once. Yeah, older games used to be shorter. Even Dark Souls is relatively short for an RPG. You can beat it in about 30 hours if you know what you're doing. But you didn't jump back in just to play New Game Plus. You jumped back in because there was still more to see, more builds to play with, whole areas and extra content you missed out on the first time. In a lot of newer games, I find that they have longer run times, which is good, but there's this unbalance between narrative and gameplay, and this need to have most of the content beaten, like required to beat the game, which is bad. Because on repeat playthroughs, not having that consumable pick up and put down experience is actually making games shorter, because their shelf lives are shorter. Back in the day, $60, that got you a lot of replayability. In Dark Souls, believe it or not, like half of the entire game is optional. Nearly half the boss fights, you don't even have to do them. Entire areas like the sewers, the painted world, they could just be skipped. Do you know the restraint the developers had to have had knowing that their hard work was only seen by the most dedicated players? Even access to the DLC expansion for this game was so cryptic that I had to look up a step-by-step guide to be able to fight some of the best bosses in the game. Calamite, Artorias, fucking Manus? I take that back. These are some of the best fights in the entire Souls series, completely hidden away. Now, I don't think that every game should be punishingly difficult. That's nonsense. But I do think every game should be able to challenge you to an extent. And there's more ways that you can challenge a player without difficulty. You can have challenging puzzles. You can have a challenging narrative that subverts the player's expectations. It doesn't have to be just difficulty. Hell, I've played some sim management games like Factorio, for example, where the difficulty comes from your personal goals of optimization. Remember, it's not your job to engage with a game, it's the game's job to engage with you. Difficulty and accessibility are two different things. People with hearing issues or in noisy environments, well, they like having subtitles, they appreciate it. People with limited mobility, they like feeling acknowledged with things like adaptive controllers. People with color blindness, they appreciate high contrast modes. But I've never heard of anyone, not a single person say, I appreciate when a game acknowledges that I'm an idiot. One thing Dark Souls does, and how replaying it reminded me of everything I miss about video games, is that it acknowledges my intelligence. That shouldn't be an accessibility option. It should be a baseline. I want to thank you for hanging out with me this far into the video. If you want to add to this discussion in any way, let's talk about it far, far below in the ruins at Blighttown, or below in the comment section. Also, if you like these general gaming discussions, analysis videos, essays if you want to call them that, and you feel like sticking around, I have an entire playlist now. Maybe check it out? Alright, later.